Okay, welcome to our class on religious warfare in France and Germany. I just wanted to show you this screen first. So at the beginning of every class, this screen will be visible to you all. This is a list of the ID terms that we're going to cover in today's class that will be on the final exam. Some students like to either take pictures or note them down. Please note you don't actually need to do this. All of these terms are already listed on Canvas with the definitions, but this is just to remind you during class that these are particularly important terms for you to remember. Okay, so um, yes, religious war and religion in France and Germany. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. But in order to learn a bit about that, we first need to learn a little bit about the Reformation. So this is normally the stage in class where I would ask you, what can you tell me about the Reformation? And usually people answer began with Martin Luther. It began in the beginning of the 16th century. Protestants split off from Catholics, and then Europe was divided religiously forevermore. The essence, I guess, of what the Reformation was about. So we'll give a little bit more detail um, on the Reformation. The Reformation certainly divided Europe into Christian factions. It was not the first split in Christianity. The first schism in Christianity happened in 1054 between the Eastern Orthodox Church and Catholicism in Western Europe. And so the Reformation is really a fragmentation of that Western Christianity. So it gets further subdivided between Catholics and various Protestant denominations. You can see on the screen I say it was motivated by religious concerns. Obviously, that is a big part of it, but also political concerns. Essentially, the Reformation survives and thrives because political leaders find it advantageous to switch religions for political or for financial reasons as opposed to pure spirituality. Obviously begins with Martin Luther, although again Luther was not the first critic of the Catholic Church. There had been other reformers, Jan Hus and John Wycliffe, who were operating at the end of the 14th, early 15th century, were very critical of the Catholic Church as well. Jan Hus actually was burned at the stake as a result. But Luther survives, as I said on the screen, because his ideas have political appeal. Luther basically says, well, the Catholic Church is corrupt and it is taking too many taxes from German princes in particular. Obviously, if German princes no longer need to pay taxes, that money gets to stay in Germany. So a lot of German princes were actually very attracted to Luther's idea. Luther also rejected the kind of legal authority of the church. The church operated canon courts essentially, where they would, I guess, interfere with the jurisdiction of German princes. And Luther was saying, well, you should expel these kind of canon courts from your lands. And that meant, of course, that all legal power was now in the hands of princes who expelled canon courts. And again, this was attractive to them. So Luther himself was obviously very devoted religiously to the cause of Christianity. But it's his ideas having appeal amongst the German princes. That's why Luther survives and Protestantism begins to thrive. So, in 1517, Luther nailed this many theses to the door in Wittenberg, 95. Operating about 20 years after Luther, we have John Calvin. John Calvin was a Frenchman, and he published his big, I guess, announcement to the Christian world of his essentially his break with Catholicism in 1535. His book, The Institutes of Christian Religion. But he was even more radical than Luther. So again, he wasn't a follower of Luther. He had ideas that actually were quite different from Luther. And his big idea was predestination. So to sum up, I guess maybe the differences between Catholic Church, Lutheranism, and Calvinism. The Catholic Church believed that two things got you into heaven: strength of your faith and good works. That was very important. Luther becomes associated with the phrase justification by faith alone. So your faith is the only thing that will get you into heaven. So God judges essentially whether you are a strong enough believer or not, and that's how you get into heaven. Calvin said that good works and faith, all very important, but God had already made up his mind before you were born about whether you were going to get into heaven. This is the idea of predestination, that God had chosen a group of people that were called the elect. And the elect were going to go to heaven on Judgment Day, and everyone else, unfortunately, was going to fiery hell. Um, and I guess my quick question for you guys is, why might the idea of predestination have potentially been problematic for society? And the answer you hopefully would have given was that, well, if God has already chosen, why does anyone have to be kind of good or follow laws in our day and age? Because God's already decided. And Calvin did understand that as well. And so the second question I have is, how did Calvin kind of play upon people's vanity, I guess, to persuade them to act and live good Christian lives even after preaching predestination? And the answer was basically that Calvin said that those who are chosen, those who are elect, they will automatically live good, just Christian lives. And so if you're living one of these lives, that's a sign to others that you have been chosen. And so even though potentially the idea of predestination could have led to chaos, Calvin naturally kind of created a system where, well, there's reasons for you to act and live in a good Christian manner because people will think you've been picked for heaven. Okay, so Jeopardy question, the link between them. So the link between Catherine of Aragon, Anne of Cleves, Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, Jane Seymour, Catherine Parr. And hopefully some of you guys would know that these are the 6 wives of Henry VIII. And I don't know if any of you guys have heard a little poem to distinguish between them, and especially to distinguish between what happened to each of these 6 ladies. We will play the poem now.
Divorced, beheaded and died. Divorced, beheaded, survived.
So, Catherine of Aragon was Henry's first wife. She was divorced. Anne Boleyn, as the poem says, beheaded. Jane Seymour died. Anne of Cleves was divorced. Catherine Howard was beheaded, and Catherine Parr survived. That's the 6 wives of Henry VIII, and actually there's recently been a musical called Six that focuses on the lives of these 6 women as opposed to focusing on the king himself. Okay, Henry VIII creates the Anglican Church in England. The Anglican Church, it's often called Episcopalianism in the United States. He creates it really for political reasons. When Luther came out and nailed his 95 Theses to the door in 1517, Henry actually wrote and published a pamphlet kind of condemning Luther and avowing his loyalty to the Catholic Church. So, what changed? Why does Henry himself eventually split from the Catholic Church? Well, it came down to the fact that Henry was married to Catherine of Aragon, and Catherine of Aragon was unable to produce a male heir. And Henry decided to ask for permission to have this marriage annulled and to marry someone else. Again, there's a distinction between annulment and divorce. The Catholic Church obviously forbade divorce, but annulment was basically the church saying, well, that marriage should not have gone ahead in the first place, and therefore it's cancelled. And again, we might not really see much of a difference between those divorce and annulment, but on points of doctrine, the Catholic Church felt there was a big difference between the two. So Henry wrote to the Pope and said, oh, I would like to have my marriage annulled. But the issue was, in fact, not even that he wanted to have his marriage annulled. He said, I should never have received permission to be married to Catherine of Aragon in the first place. And this is true, because Catherine of Aragon was originally married to Henry's older brother, Arthur. So they were married. Arthur then died, and Henry had to get special permission from the Catholic Church to marry Catherine of Aragon in the first place. Why did Henry need special permission? Well, according to how the Catholic Church saw it at this time, because Catherine was already married to Arthur, it would actually be incestuous for Catherine to then marry Henry as well. So they got special permission originally for the marriage to take place. Henry changed his mind and wants out of the marriage in the middle of the 1520s. And he writes to the Pope asking for this marriage, to be annulled. Should never have gotten permission. The problem is Rome is being occupied by Charles V. Who is Charles V? Charles V is the Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful man in Europe, and nephew of Catherine of Aragon. And so the Pope is kind of in a spot where he's trying to he essentially tries to bide for time. Tells Henry, well, we're going to consider this, we're going to weigh things up, but really he's trying to give himself enough space so either Charles will leave Rome and then he can annul the marriage, or maybe Catherine will die, or something that will kind of get him out of this predicament. But nothing actually comes up. And in the end, in 1534, Henry finally kind of formally breaks with the Catholic Church. He'd already split with Catherine of Aragon by that stage to marry Anne Boleyn. But so again, the Anglican Church was created for really more political reasons as opposed to religious reasons. And that's why, of all the Protestant denominations, Episcopalianism is the closest doctrinally to Catholicism. They instead of the Pope being the head of the church, they put the King of England as the head of the church. But other than that, there are some other minor differences too, but it is not as far removed from Catholicism as Lutheranism, and certainly not as far removed as Catholicism. And so that sound effect is to represent the fact that religious warfare essentially dominates Europe in the 16th up until the 17th century, and that's what we're going to explore in today's class. Some of the kind of different theaters where we see this religious warfare particularly having an impact. Okay. Ignorance is Blitz. Actually, I should say this. So there's this book. It's the same book, but it has different names. Sometimes it's called Ignorance is Blitz. An earlier version was called Non Campus Mentis. It's essentially all the bad answers that students have given to kind of exam questions over the years. College students, obviously, that is. And so I'm posting them. So these are supposed to be funny. Hopefully you will see some humor in them as well. And so there's a few of them here actually. So we'll look at this one first. Henry VIII divorced his original wife, who became old and impregnable. Elizabeth I was eventually the daughter of Henry VIII, and obviously VIII misspelled. Elizabeth certainly was the daughter of Henry VIII, but that is not how he spelled VIII. Calvin was born a generation after Luther and is seen as one of Luther's great predecessors. Obviously, you can't be someone's predecessor if you're born after them. He accepted all of Luther's ideas except that of birth. I don't know exactly what that person was going for there. Calvinists were the only ones who believed in predetonation. So not predestination, predetonation. It is not surprising that their preaching consisted mainly of dogmatic explosions. And then the final one, and probably the best one. John Calvin Klein translated the Bible into American so the people of Geneva could read it. Now, John Calvin was based in Geneva. This was a city he essentially set up a theocracy of, so that part is correct. But obviously translating the Bible into American, more of a controversial idea, I guess, in history. Okay. So essentially we're going to look at two places, France and Germany, for religious warfare. The first place we're going to look at is France. And in France, we start to see Calvinism in particular. So Protestantism, yes, but Calvinism is the particular form of Protestantism that begins to spread in France. It begins to spread in France in the 1540s, and by 1560, about 10% of the French population was Protestant or was Calvinist, or the French term was Huguenot, although it's commonly pronounced in English Huguenot or Huguenot. And And this was obviously quite a challenge to royal authority and a shock to devoutly Catholic France. My first question is, why do you think France in particular was a good place for Calvin's ideas to spread? And this question, actually, people sometimes stumble over it a little bit, but there's a couple of reasons why Calvinism spread to France in particular. Firstly, John Calvin was French. And so in his book Institutes of the Christian Religion, a lot of his publications and communications were in French. The second thing is proximity. The city of Geneva, here we go, is here. This is Lake Geneva. Here's Geneva. And obviously Geneva is very close to the French border. I actually took a train from Lyon to Geneva a couple of years ago. So they are quite close. And Calvinist ideas begin trickling into France, and especially in the south of France, because that's closer to where Geneva and his Calvinist ideas, Calvin and his ideas are spreading from Geneva. So, born in Provence in 1503, he became famous by supposedly predicting the death of King Henry, the French King Henry II, in 1559. So who is this person? This is someone called Nostradamus. Usually students actually do not get Nostradamus, and when I ask students, they've never heard of Nostradamus. And perhaps that's a sign of a changing times, but in the late 90s, Nostradamus was everywhere. There was lots of History Channel shows about him. So and certainly even if you look online today, there's Nostradamus' predictions for last year. There's a whole kind of industry of people trying to interpret the predictions of Nostradamus. But according to legend, according to tradition, he became famous because he had written a poem that vaguely talked about the older line or the younger line killing the older line. And this was interpreted afterwards to be talking about the death of Henry II. So Henry II is King of France. He is very actively trying to repress Calvinism in France, cruelly trying to repress Calvinism. He has some Calvinists executed. He dies in a joust in 1559. The other guy's spear, I guess, went into his lance. Went into the little eye slot in his helmet. And he died after 10 days of suffering miserable agony, blood poisoning, I guess, from the wound that he suffered. So once Henry died, this actually creates a power vacuum in France. So we already have Protestantism growing in the country. We now have a monarchy in turmoil. Henry has sons. He does not die without an heir. In fact, he has 3 sons, and all 3 will eventually rule France. The problem is they're all very young. And so there are noble families in France that are trying to exploit this kind of vulnerability of the monarchy, not to take it over for themselves, but to ensure that they are the power makers in France. One of them is the Guy family. The Guy family own lands in the north of France. They are very pro-Catholic, and they're trying to position themselves to be the power behind the throne, basically. And brings us to our next Jeopardy question. So one of the Guys, the daughter of Mary of Guy, she was Queen of France from 1559 to 1560, so only 1 year, as well as Queen of another country, and she was played by Saoirse Ronan, or Saoirse Ronan, as she inaccurately pronounces her name, in 2019. And the answer is Mary, Queen of Scots. So Mary, Queen of Scots, was married to the son of Henry II. That was a man called Francis. I say a man, he was actually only 15 when Henry died. So Francis becomes Francis II, King of France, and his wife Mary of Guy. So you can see the Guy family have a big in. They're married into the royal family already. But unfortunately for them, and unfortunately for Francis only lives 1 year. He dies when he's 16 in 1560. That's why Mary, her reign as French queen was actually very short. And into the vacuum steps his younger brother again, a man by the name of Charles, who becomes Charles IX. So it's spelled Charles, but we're going to pronounce it the French way, Charles IX. The rivals of the Guy family were in the south. again, in the Calvinist lands, in the lands of the Huguenots. They are the Bourbon family. They're led by the Protestant Duke of Conde, and they're both kind of eyeing up one another in trying to gain influence over the French king, who is now Charles IX, and eventually civil war erupts between both sides. So both sides, so you can understand this obviously is partly a religious conflict in nature, because the Guy are Catholic, the Bourbon are Protestant, but it's about far more than just religion. It is really about these two dynastic families trying to kind of exert control over the French monarchy. So both sides bring in foreign mercenaries, and so there's essentially on and off warfare for the next 8 years. So from 1562 to 1570, France is fighting a lot of wars, but eventually, kind of both sides realize that there's not really enough. That neither side will be able to defeat one another, so there's kind of a truce called, and to try and create harmony between both sides, a marriage is proposed. Although it does not quite work out as maybe some people are expecting. But this is the beginning, I guess, of French religious conflict. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. So obviously, as you can tell from the title of the slide, this is not going to end well. So in 1572, Queen Catherine. So who is Queen Catherine? Catherine is the old wife, or the widow, I guess, of Henry II. She is the mother of the French king, Charles IX. And she offers her daughter, Margaret of Valois, as essentially as a bargaining chip. She offers her daughter in marriage to the Protestant Henry of Navarre. So Henry of Navarre is a Protestant leader. Navarre is actually in the south of France, and he owns land in the south of France. He is Huguenot, and she offers him in marriage to kind of bring peace to France. Henry was actually born as a Catholic, but he converted to Protestantism under his mother's influence, and so he's a Protestant himself. But as you see, he has a bit of a history of switching sides. So anyway, the marriage is arranged for 1572. It's going to be held on St. Bartholomew's Day, and that is obviously it is not going to go right. Let's see what happens. So on August 24th, 1572, a Catholic mob attacks the Huguenots, or the Huguenots, who had gathered for the wedding, and begins to slaughter them. Why do they attack the Huguenots? Well, there was an assassination attempt, and no one is sure who tried to assassinate a man by the name of Gaspard de Coligny. He was Admiral Gaspard de Coligny. He was an important Protestant leader. Someone tried to assassinate him, and in the wake of this assassination attempt, there was a debate between Queen Catherine, and her son, the King Charles, about what is the Protestant response going to be. And they eventually kind of talked themselves into the idea that, well, the Protestants are going to be furious at this assassination attempt, and there's going to be a backlash. There was a Protestant army actually outside the city. They worried that army might attack the city. And so, I mean, this is the kind of logic of the time to decide, well, if this attack is already coming, perhaps it's better for us to massacre the Protestant leaders ahead of time, to get in a preemptive strike, I guess, basically. And that's essentially what happens. They begin slaughtering Protestant leaders, including Gaspard de Coligny, who's killed in the second attempt, and the massacre begins to spread to the countryside as well. In total, it's estimated that somewhere between 5,000 and 12,000 French Huguenots, French Calvinists, are massacred by Catholic mobs. And now there is very clearly a breach between the Catholic and Protestant sides again. And of course, what happened to Henry of Navarre? Well, Henry of Navarre and many of the leading Huguenots did manage to escape Paris. The plot of Catherine and Charles to kill all the Protestant leaders. It doesn't fully succeed. A lot of Protestant leaders get out. They now see the monarchy as their enemy again and renew war against against the French crown. I ask the question this time: how did Henry of Navarre persuade the Catholics of Paris to spare his life? And the story goes that the Catholic mob was beating on the door of his private chambers where where Margaret, his new wife, and Henry were hiding. And it's actually Margaret who helped protect Henry, and Henry eventually agreed to convert to Catholicism in order to not be massacred basically by the rioters. Again, they weren't stupid, that is, the rioters. I mean, he was kept under close observation in Paris for the next 2 years. But finally, he sees his chance to escape. He escapes and then converts back to Calvinism again. And actually, Henry of Navarre, he ends up being a total cad in terms of his. So, despite the fact that it was Margaret who saved his life on St. Bartholomew's Day, he ended up being totally unfaithful to her, and she was not a very happy wife of Henry over the years. But he did get out. He's in charge of the Huguenots. But the Catholic side also is beginning to see differences emerge between them. There are two basic groups in Catholic France. There are the Catholic League, led by the House of Guise. The Catholic League is very pro-Catholic. Their basic philosophy is that we need to drive out all the Protestants of France. France will never be at peace so long as Protestantism remains in France. The Catholic League, however, is also seen by some people as a kind of a foreign, is correctly seen as being very influenced by foreign money, in particular the money of the King of Spain. So at this stage, that's Philip II, is King of Spain. He is funding the Catholic League in France, and so some people question the loyalty of the Catholic League to France, or are they loyal to a much wider Protestant cause? On the other hand, there are the politiques, and the question is, well, what do you think the politiques were in favour of if they disagreed with the Catholic League? Basically, the politiques believed that there should be compromise, that we have to learn to live with the Calvinists. They're not going anywhere. We can't kill them all. It also kind of rejected the Catholicism of the Catholic League, not because of Catholicism itself, but because it felt that it was essentially they were doing the bidding of the King of Spain. And so they kind of their loyalty lay much more closer to the French crown than the Catholic League, I guess, would have liked. Okay. So the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre happened on St. Valentine's Day. And actually, my confession is this was not from this book. Most of these quotes are from this book. This was actually a wrong answer a student gave in one of my own exams a couple of years ago. But obviously, you might not know a whole lot about when St. Bartholomew's Day is, but you should at least understand that it wasn't on the same day as St. Valentine's Day. Okay, that little bell there that's going to go off every time we are coming across an ID term. So the bell rings, and that's to let you know we're about to discuss something that could be on the final exam. And obviously the War of the Three Henries was an ID term that was mentioned at the beginning of class. So the extremism of the Catholic League, which is led by not just by the House of Guise, but have a guess of the first name of the leader of that house? Henry of Guise. So the extremism of the Catholic League frightened King Henry III. Who is King Henry III? Well, he was the younger brother of Charles IX. Charles IX died in 1574. As his brother Francis before him, he died without an heir. And Henry took over in 1574. Henry actually was King of Poland for a couple of years. To solve a kind of crisis in Poland, he accepted an invitation from Polish nobles to occupy the Polish throne because he didn't think he would be King of France. Charles was young enough that he could still have children, and so Henry wasn't really thinking in these terms. But when Charles dies unexpectedly in 1574, Henry renounces the Polish throne and returns to become King of France instead. However, it seems that Henry was unable to father any children. His wife was Louise of Lorraine. Some people speculate maybe she was infertile. Some people speculate that Henry was gay. He certainly had a reputation amongst the French court of not being a very kind of manly man. He One of his kind of hobbies was he liked to dress his wife up as a kind of like a doll figure and put makeup on her and put her in dresses. And so yeah, there was a general sense of femininity about Henry that more of the macho nobles of France didn't really like. And as Henry is, so we have the three Henrys. We have Henry of Guise, we have King Henry the Third, son of Henry II, and then the third Henry is Henry of Navarre. Henry of Navarre obviously is on the side of the Protestants. King Henry is more politique. He does not like the Catholic League. He does not like the fact that they have money from the King of Spain and they're under his influence. And rumours begin to spread that King Henry III is planning to assassinate Henry of Guise. And Henry of Guise essentially laughs at these rumours. He basically says, well, that guy, that King Henry is going to assassinate me. King Henry wouldn't have the balls to do that. And obviously playing upon rumours of Henry's kind of femininity. Well, Henry did have the balls, and Henry of Guise was assassinated in 1587. But this kickstarted a new religious war in France, this time the Catholic League fighting against the politiques. And so this forces Henry to ally himself with Henry of Navarre. So the politiques are allied for a while with the Protestants against the Catholic League. So this even starts in 1587. Then King Henry himself was assassinated by a disgruntled Guise supporter in 1589. This was bad news for France because the House of Valois had run out of men. So Henry II, Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III, so father and his three sons, none of them were able to produce, well, obviously Henry II was, but none of the three children were able to produce male heirs. And so that meant that the House of Valois died out, and they had to go back through the bloodline to find out what's often called a cadet branch, so that somewhere along the line a younger brother had sons, and that populated a new branch. That's the end of the House of Valois. They went back and looked through the bloodlines, and obviously it was, well, they would have realized this by 1589, but it was realized that the next in line for the throne was Henry of Navarre. And this is now France essentially is faced with, well, let me ask you guys, why did many French people oppose Henry of Navarre becoming King of France? The obvious answer is, well, Henry of Navarre is a Protestant. Even the politiques, even the people who say we want to compromise with the Protestants, for them, a Protestant king is a step too far. One thing to live with Protestants, something very different to be ruled by Protestants. And so, what do you think Henry of Navarre could do to dilute opposition to him becoming king? And the answer is,
change your mind like a girl changes clothes.
yes, that Henry of Navarre could convert to Catholicism once more. We've already seen he has shifted back and forth between both sides in the past. Why not do it again? Henry actually does try and fight on as or win the crown for himself as a Protestant, but he realizes the opposition to that is too bitter. And so eventually in 1593, I guess he converts to Catholicism, and he finally became king in 1594. And Henry's famous comment about this was, Paris is well worth a mass. That sure, I'll go to mass on Sunday. I'll pretend I'm a good Catholic in order to be given the French crown, and he was. He did not forget the Protestants, however, and in 1598 he passed something called, or proclaimed something called the Edict of Nantes. Nantes is obviously a city in France. The Edict of Nantes is a rule that allowed some measure of religious toleration to Protestants. I mean, it's not total equality. There are restrictions placed on Protestants. So Protestantism is confined to the areas where it already exists. but it is not permitted by the Edict of Nantes to grow further. Conversely, there is nothing in the Edict of Nantes that says that Catholicism cannot spread into Protestant areas. Protestantism is also forbidden in Paris and any kind of outlying areas of Paris, obviously the centre of the French kingdom. So it's not total equality, but it is a measure of equality. It's probably the most religiously tolerant measure taken in Europe at this stage. And so for a while, Protestants and Catholics coexist in France. They won't eventually, we'll see in the future that the Protestants will eventually be kicked out of France. But for now, Henry has brought some measure of compromise to France. And that essentially ends the religious wars in France. If you guys were in class, we would read the document, the Edict of Nantes, the primary source document. So again, as this is our first class, every class I bring a primary source document, we stop for 10 minutes, we read it, we discuss it, we answer these questions, and then we proceed with the lecture again. But obviously not today because I'm not here. You can access all the primary sources for this class on the course Canvas page. Okay, here's Non-Campus Mentis. So again, the same book as earlier on. The religious war in France was known as the War of the Three Henrys, as it was fought between Henry III, true, Henry of Guise, not exactly, and Francis II. Henry Bourbon married Edict of Nantes and became King of France with the promise to reconsecrate the country to Catholicism. So again, you can obviously see some of the errors there, but Edict of Nantes is a place, or was a law passed in Nantes. It is not a person. The second half of this class, we're going to talk about the Holy Roman Empire. And what exactly was the Holy Roman Empire? Where was it? Essentially, modern Germany. The country we know as Germany today did not come into existence until 1871. So there's a big chunk of Central Europe where they all speak the same language, essentially, but they are not united into one kingdom. They're actually divided into lots of little different kingdoms that have some minimal loyalty to a wider entity called the Holy Roman Empire. But it is not a very strong, centrally organized kingdom. So, for example, France and England, they are strong, centralized kingdoms. That means that what the king says in France is basically law. What the king says in England is basically law. But that is not the case in Germany. That the Holy Roman Emperor exists, but local kings have a lot more power and say over what happens in their kingdom. So the Holy Roman Empire, let's have a little look at a map and it'll give you an idea how the kingdom spread and contracted and retracted over the years. So it starts in 962. Obviously, it's much of Europe and even Italy. It loses its Italian lands eventually. As you can see, it's getting smaller all the time. And then finally, it's going to disappear in 1806. Actually, it's Napoleon Bonaparte essentially kills off the Holy Roman Empire. And it caused it to disappear. There is a famous quote about the Holy Roman Empire by a man called Voltaire, a brilliant 18th century thinker and writer who we will meet in a later class. We'll actually read a primary source document of Voltaire. But Voltaire said, "The Holy Roman Empire is neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire." And essentially he was right. Well, you guys can judge for yourselves whether the Holy Roman Empire was really holy or not. But it certainly wasn't Roman. By the time we're looking at the Holy Roman Empire, its connections with Rome, and clearly there was once a connection with Rome. Rome was part of the Holy Roman Empire, and when it was first proclaimed, essentially it was supposed to be a renewed form of the old Roman Empire. But by the time Voltaire's writing, there's nothing Roman at all about the Holy Roman Empire. I mean, it's not connected to Rome. And then, is it an empire? No, it's not. Because there's not really any power in the office of the emperor. Their office exists, yes, but he's not a powerful man like the King of Spain or the King of France, and it doesn't really function as an empire in that sense. So the 30 Years' War, we want to understand a little bit of what the 30 Years' War was, but to do that we need a little bit of background. So the Holy Roman Emperor, as we saw, he actually wanted to copy what existed already in France and England and Spain. He wanted to be essentially the king of Germany. And this meant that he was trying to suppress and control the local nobles, the local princes. This was a process that also played out in France and England. In France and England, the king won. And local nobles who were independently rich, who oftentimes had private armies, and that's why they were a threat to royal power, essentially lost those rights and privileges and wealth over the years. Maybe not so much the wealth, but certainly the ability to raise private armies and to challenge a monarchy. They lost those rights. They don't lose them in Germany. But the Holy Roman Emperor would like to remove these power or these rights of power and privilege from local princes. So there's kind of this tension between the emperor and local princes about where real power lies. There had been religious war in Germany, especially in the 1530s and 1540s. Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, he was ruling in the Holy Roman Empire when Luther broke with the Catholic Church. But he was too involved actually in fighting wars against France and against the Ottoman Empire to really take steps to suppress Protestantism. It's not until the 1530s he finally decides, okay, we need to do something about Protestants. We need to defeat them in battle and crush the growth of Protestantism in Germany. So he fought something called the Schmalkaldic League. The Schmalkaldic League was an alliance of German princes that were Protestant. They fought against Charles V, and actually Charles essentially found that he could win battles. I mean, Charles was a much more powerful man than these German princes, but because he had allowed Protestantism to spread for 20 years before doing something, he basically found that it had become too deeply rooted. And so the Peace of Augsburg in 1555 was a recognition of this, that Charles brought this in, and essentially the principle that it was to be guided with was cuius regio, eius religio. Cuius regio, eius religio. What that means is whose realm, his religion. If I'm the king of Bavaria, let's just say, and I'm a Catholic, that means Bavaria, all the Bavarians have to be Catholic. If I'm the king of Saxony, that means, and I'm a Protestant, that means that all the people of Saxony have to be Protestant. So this is what the Peace of Augsburg brought in. It allowed for Catholic or Lutheran leaders to govern their territories without being molested by the Holy Roman Empire. It did not permit Calvinism. And in some ways that kind of helped because there were German Calvinists, so that helped increase the tension over the next over the next several decades. So that's the Peace of Augsburg that was signed in 1555. Actually, as soon as it was signed, Charles V resigned his position as emperor and retired to a monastery. And so we're taking up the story again in the early 1600s. There was a man called Rudolf who was the Holy Roman Emperor, but a lot of people thought he was a bit unstable, and including his brother Matthias. Matthias fought a rebellion against Rudolf, and in 1612 he took over as Holy Roman Emperor. So he forced Rudolf to retire. He took over as Holy Roman Emperor, and he had a nephew. So we'll come to that in a second. He had a nephew. This is the Jeopardy question. Containing the capital of Prague, this area is the largest region in the modern country of Czechia. What is Bohemia? Yes. So Ferdinand was the nephew of Matthias. He wasn't the son of, wasn't Rudolf's son, different father. And in 1617, Matthias himself did not have any sons. He was looking to Ferdinand as a potential heir as the Holy Roman Emperor. The Holy Roman Emperor is a little bit different. It does not automatically pass to the heir of, or it doesn't automatically pass to the eldest son of the current ruler. There are 7 electors, and they actually choose the Holy Roman Emperor. So this was Matthias's efforts to kind of show that Ferdinand was a capable young man. He was put in charge of Bohemia, and the idea is he's going to govern Bohemia for a few years and then hopefully take over as Holy Roman Emperor. The problem is that Bohemia is exceptionally Protestant. I mentioned Jan Hus getting burned early at the stake earlier on. Well, Jan Hus was from Bohemia, and so they had a long tradition actually of not accepting everything that came from the Catholic Church. And when the Reformation broke out, not surprisingly, Bohemia was a hotbed of Protestantism. Ferdinand is very much a Catholic, and he's insistent on converting Bohemia back to Catholicism. And not surprisingly, this causes tension on both sides. So, I'll take a step backwards to that. So, Ferdinand in 1618, excuse me, Ferdinand sends his representatives to Prague, where the rebels, that is the Protestant leaders of Bohemia, have been gathering. He sends two important representatives to Prague to confront the rebels and to tell them essentially to stand down. And instead, the rebels defenester the two representatives. What does defenestration mean? Well, if you speak German, you might actually have a really good guess, because Fenster is German for window, and so fenêtre in French, veneta in Spanish, I think. It means to throw someone out the window. So the defenestration of Prague, you can see the picture here. They're throwing the representatives out the window, and telling Ferdinand clearly that we're not going to listen to you. This wasn't some kind of gentle, plop 5 feet out of the window down to the ground. This was actually 70 feet up in the air. So by throwing them out the window, they were intending to kill the two representatives of Ferdinand. But the two representatives actually survived. And you can imagine how both sides essentially tried to spin that as a result. The representatives of Ferdinand, the Catholic side, said that angels escorted the two men as they were flying to earth and held them up and ensured that they landed on their feet and were okay. The Protestant side said there was an enormous lump of horse shit outside the window and that they landed in the horse shit, and that's why they survived. So again, you can pick whichever version you want, but the idea is very clear. There is now going to be open rebellion in Bohemia, where Ferdinand is king, and eventually this is going to spread to all the Holy Roman Empire. So, and it's going to spread because
the fuck out!
Sorry, I forgot that was in there. But yes, that was the message essentially that they were sending to Ferdinand and his representatives. Ferdinand becomes the Holy Roman Emperor the following year in 1619. And he brings his religious war not just to Bohemia, but also begins to kind of confront other Protestant princes as well, and eventually starts attacking them and defeating them militarily in battle. And so that's the beginning of the 30 Years' War. 30 Years' War is actually a very complex conflict. We're really basically going to summarize the important turning points in it. We're not going to get into all of it for sure, because it is a very complex conflict. So, the 30 Years' War. Firstly, I'm going to play this.
Let's get ready to rumble!
So, that was the voice of Michael Buffer. I assume some of you guys would be familiar with that, boxing fights or things like that over the years. Michael Buffer is actually a very wealthy man, and Michael Buffer is a very wealthy man because he sues people who use that phrase without his permission. And so please don't tell Michael Buffer that we use that clip in the video. Although actually I think this is a video for educational purposes, so I don't think he can sue us. But he is quite a litigious man apparently. Anyway, the 30 Years' War. So the First of the war was fought initially in Germany, but the reason I played the Michael Buffer clip is that all of the European countries essentially get involved at one stage. So Denmark is the first foreign power to enter the war in 1625. They're led by Christian IV, and Denmark enters the war expecting some other countries to do the same. They do not, and actually Christian IV finds himself up against a very capable military commander, Albrecht von Wallenstein. Albrecht von Wallenstein is probably the most capable military commander of all Europe in the 17th century. However, he's a little bit like Henry of Navarre. He has a history of switching sides religiously, and he also has a very eccentric habit, or I guess trait, especially eccentric for a military commander, and that is that he hated noise. He hated noise. And so whenever his forces took over a city or conquered a town, one of the first things that was to be done was that his men would go through the town and kill all the cats and dogs, the things that were making background noise. He hated kind of noise in the background, and animals in particular seemed to irritate him. Eccentric but very capable, and Denmark withdraws from the war in 1629. Denmark obviously was a Protestant nation. They were trying to help the Protestant side. 1629, when Christian withdraws Danish forces, that really marks the high water mark of the Catholic side. That is, the Catholic side seems to be getting on top, seems to be about to, maybe even convert the Holy Roman Empire into a single German kingdom that not only does not have independent princes, but also is Catholic. And kind of recognizing that good fortune, or that his fortunes were rising, Ferdinand issued the Edict of Restitution in 1629. What did that do? Well, it firstly re-emphasized the law forbidding Calvinism, which clearly was an effort to kind of split the Protestant sides, because not all Protestants liked Calvinists. Also, it restored all church property that had been taken by Protestants since 1552. Some of this had been quite legitimately purchased, or this was German kingdoms that had converted to Protestantism, and the land had been, by the terms of the Peace of Augsburg, had been legally seized. So Ferdinand saying all this land has to go back to the Catholic Church. This then brings another army into the war, and that's the Swedish side. They're led by a man called Gustavus Adolphus. They enter the war in 1630. Gustavus Adolphus himself is quite a capable military commander. And eventually, in 1632, he fights a battle against Albrecht von Wallenstein. The battle itself is essentially a draw. Neither side gains the upper hand. But Gustavus Adolphus dies in this battle, and then Sweden essentially withdraws from the war after 1632. Gustavus Adolphus College is a third level educational institution in what state? And for those of you who don't know, you obviously have to think of it's a state that has a lot of Scandinavian influence. And if you've never been there, Minnesota in particular has a gigantic Scandinavian community there, or at least people of Scandinavian descent. That's where Gustavus Adolphus College is. Next, France enters the war. France enters the war in 1635 on the Protestant side. And my question, if we were in class, would be, why does Catholic France enter the 30 Years' War on the Protestant side? Well, this is reinforcing the point we're kind of making throughout the lectures, that yes, religious warfare, the wars are partly religious, but politics really is more important than religious warfare. And the Catholic France is looking at this situation and saying that, well, Ferdinand may be able to create a single unified Catholic German kingdom. But is that what France wants? France is used to having these lots of divided. I mean, how many kingdoms are in the Holy Roman Empire? Around 1500, there were about 1,000. So these were very fragmented. Now, there's less of them by the 17th century. But still, we're talking hundreds of kingdoms. That's what France is used to having on its border. It does not want a single, strong, unified Germany beside it, because it thinks that'll be bad news. And ultimately, when Germany does become united in the 19th century, France realizes it is bad news. And this is where essentially the Franco-Prussian War, the First World War, and the Second World War all start from this Franco-German enmity between the two nations. That's why Catholic France enters on the Protestant side. So they already had been secretly funding Gustavus Adolphus, trying to help the Protestant side, but then they formally enter the war in 1635. Oh, and of course, not only do they not want to have Germany as a powerful neighbor in their eastern border, they also don't want to be in a Habsburg sandwich, because in the south, to the south of France, is Spain. Spain is governed by the Habsburgs, and Ferdinand is also a Habsburg. So in Spain, I think we have Philip IV is the King of Spain in the mid-1630s. Ferdinand II is definitely a Habsburg as well. So there's dynastic connections. France feels it'll be in the middle of a kind of a Habsburg sandwich. It does not want that either. And so that's why it officially goes to war. A turning point in the war is the Battle of Rocroi in Rocroi in 1643. Rocroi is a very important battle because for the previous century, over more than a century, the military battlefields of Europe were dominated by the Spanish tercios. This was a military formation that combined pikemen with muskets. Very effective. It was actually essentially unbeaten in battle for 120 years. But when the Spanish fight the French in 1643, the French actually gain a victory. And so that is the long-term signal that Spain is now going to be relegated to a second power in Europe, and the dominant new power emerging in Europe is actually France. They first defeat the Spanish, then they turn on the armies of the Holy Roman Empire and begin defeating them, and essentially turn the tide and win the war for the Protestant side. So non-campus mentis, let's have a look at some of these. So the 30 Years' War, 1638 to 1642. Again, actually, this is not from non-campus mentis. This was an answer a student gave. This was not a Gonzaga answer. This was an answer a student gave to me in my previous institution. But there you go. The 30 Years' War lasted 4 years. The 30 Years' War began with the defecation of Prague. So again, not the defenestration, the defecation of Prague. Prague was the capital, misspelled, of Bulimia. So again, Prague is the capital of Bohemia, not Bulimia. And the Holy Roman Empire soon collapsed like a house of cards. Well, they misspelled the name, but actually in principle they're right, that the Holy Roman Empire, essentially this is the kind of the beginning of the end. The end of the 30 Years' War sets the Holy Roman Empire into a long decline. So the treaty to bring about the end of the war is called the Peace of Westphalia, and so actually it took a long time to negotiate. Decades of war with major European powers all fighting in Germany had left Germany desolate. The German population in 1618 was about 20 million people. The German population by 1648 was 16 million people. Now, that doesn't mean that all 16 people were killed or all 4 million died as a result of the war, but it meant that population shrank as people either were killed when they were younger and couldn't have children to repopulate, or people decided not to have children because they felt it wasn't a good climate to raise children in. So, by 1648, both Catholics and Protestants want a peaceful resolution. They want to end the war. So, Ferdinand II has died by this stage, so he's been replaced by his son Ferdinand III as the Holy Roman Emperor, and so he could call the Peace of Westphalia essentially the Peace of Augsburg for slow learners. If you remember, the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, it allowed Catholics or Protestants allowed Catholic or Lutheran rulers to pick the religion for their kingdom. It did not allow Calvinists. This is addressed with the Peace of Westphalia. Calvinist princes were now also welcome. But you could say a lot of people died to bring about what should have been obvious in the middle of the 16th century with the Peace of Augsburg. By this stage, the states of the Holy Roman Empire have consolidated. So if we had about 1,000 of these in the year 1500, by 1648 these have consolidated down to about 300. Still a very large number, but some of the smaller ones have gotten gobbled up by some of the bigger ones. They essentially become almost independent or totally independent. That the office of the Holy Roman Empire still exists, or the emperor still exists, but he has almost no power. And so essentially, if I'm king of Bavaria or king of Saxony, I'm free to do whatever I want. The big winners in the war are France and Sweden. They both gained territories. France to its southern border, Sweden along the Baltic coast. And although actually war continues between the French and the Spanish, so even though the Peace of Westphalia ends the war in Germany, the French and Spanish continue to fight one another until 1659, until the peace is finally signed between them. And the reason the Peace of Westphalia is important, the reason essentially our course is beginning in 1648, is that it introduces a system that's kind of essentially called the Westphalian system. What the Westphalian system basically means is that every nation is a separate sovereign entity and no other nation has a right to interfere with the religion or the politics or the goings-ons of each individual state. So so this has evolved. Essentially what people have learned is that it doesn't make sense for kings to get involved in the religious affairs of another country. And this is what essentially is, in many ways, the beginning point of modern nation states as separate from kingdoms. And we'll come back to that idea in a later class. But Westphalian system is that, you should not interfere with another country. That's that country's business. And in some ways, that's what's kind of still so shocking about the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And at the stage, at least this was being recorded, still going on, that it was an effort on the part of Russia to essentially seize control of another country or to interfere with the politics of another country. And so that would be considered to be something going against the Westphalian system, which hasn't always been honoured or respected, but essentially has survived since the middle of the 17th century. Okay, that's all the time we have for today. I hope you enjoyed this class, and I will see you again in class, and we're going to talk about constitutional monarchy in England in our next lecture. Okay, take care for now.